Hello and welcome. This is Ike Hoffman with Tactical Real Estate Solutions, and today we're going to be talking about the internal rate of return and specifically looking under the hood at the components of the IRR. We're going to be using Tactica's development model in building an IRR Sources model from scratch. Why are we doing this? Well, knowing that an IRR is 15% or 17% is helpful, but it still leaves a lot to be desired. Two different projects that both have a 17% IRR could have quite different risk thresholds that could only be uncovered by looking at the IRR sources. This video aims to give you a much more thorough understanding of the IRR metric and how the unique project components can affect the overall return. I also have a blog post on this topic to reinforce learning, and it pairs incredibly well with the video you're watching now. If you've been enjoying Tactica's investment analysis content, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like the video, subscribe to our channel, and allow us to notify you when we're releasing new content. Right now we're looking at Tactica's multifamily value add model, and in this particular workbook I include an analysis tab called IRR Sources. It's a totally independent analysis from the rest of the pro forma, and it looks at the IRR and details what investment components contribute to that overall return. So on the right side you can see we have a hold period of 10 years and an IRR of 12.65%. And then in this grid, in this model that I had already built out, we're tracking the present value of initial investment recovery, the present value of cash flow in year one, the present value of cash flow growth, the present value of asset appreciation, and finally the present value of the loan principal paydown. All of these individual facets are what contribute to the overall IRR. So let's quickly walk through it. In column C, we're tracking the present value of investment recovery. We can see we're doing a 10-year hold. So in year 10, we'd be getting $4 million back. What is that $4 million? If we go to the investment summary tab, this is just the equity needed to close the deal. We go back to the IRR Sources tab, and you can see we're running a present value calculation where we're taking that $4 million that we'll get back in 10 years from now, and we're discounting it at the IRR, which in today's terms is $1.2 million. In column D, we're tracking the present value of cash flow year one. Where is this coming from? If we go to the return summary tab, you can see our pro forma year one cash flow is $225,863. We're using an NPV formula to discount each of those cash flows at the IRR for all 10 years of the investment hold. How much we can grow that initial cash flow by. You can see in year 3, it actually dips into the negative period when the interest only period runs out. So if we look at the sum of both cash flow year 1 and the cash flow growth in year 10, we get $454,000. When we go back to the return summary tab, we can see in year 10, it's also $454,000, $366. So we're slightly more than doubling cash flow in the final year of the investment hold. We'll again do an NPV calc on all of these cash flow growth cells, discounting at the IRR. 10 years from now, we're also tracking the appreciation. So if we go back to the return summary tab, we'd be selling this property for nearly $17 million, and then we're going to take out the cost of the sale and the disposition fee. So that's $390,000 and $167,000. And then we're also going to subtract out all of the sources it took to close on this deal. So the total cost was $13.8 million. When we take the reversion price minus sales cost minus total sources, we have an appreciation of nearly $2.4 million, which is also discounted at the IRR. And finally, we track the present value of the principal paydown of our loan. Go to the return summary tab, we can see the initial outstanding loan balance is $9.75 million. When we sell this deal, we've been using cash flow and we paid down the principal balance to $8.163 million, which leaves a delta of nearly $1.6 million. And once again, we're discounting that future cash flow at the IRR. When we calculate the present value of all of these future cash flows here in row 0, it should add out to the total amount of equity we initially put into the deal in year 0, and it does, that $4.078 million number. We can then look at the present value amount for each of the 5 components, divide it by the total amount of equity, and determine each component's allocation percentage of the total IRR. So in this case, just getting your initial cash investment back when you sell the deal accounts for 30% of the total IRR. Cash flow, that cash flow year one, also equates to around 30% of the total IRR. To me, this looks like a healthy distribution. You can see we have a pie chart down here. There's a good amount of yield in each of these 5 buckets. And I think just holding the asset for 10 years tends to de-risk the project. An example of how this model can be helpful is more speculative underwriting will tend to see higher allocations to appreciation. You could be using a very aggressive residual cap rate, so you may not have a lot of cash flow, but most of your yield will come when you sell the asset one day and reap your profits via appreciation. On the flip side, more conservative underwriting would see a higher allocation of the initial investment recovery and that initial cash flow. In theory, the cash flow you're writing in year one should be the most realistic assumption you're making. You should have some historical financials and rent roll and have a very good idea of what your pro forma year one NOI is going to be. And obviously you should know your debt service as well to get to that realistic cash flow year one number. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. These allocations aren't going to mean a whole lot unless you're underwriting a lot of volume and you're tracking those allocations over every underwriting exercise so you can start picking up trends. I used to do this when I worked in the brokerage world, and it became apparent after a while, when we might be stretching on pricing or too aggressive with our rent roll. But those insights only became prevalent once I started to track this regularly and could go back and look at other deals and start to gain a feel of what a reasonable distribution is. I also have a blog post dedicated to IRR sources for value add properties. That's linked below. There's a section that actually goes over a scenario where 2 different deals have the same IRR and how those IRR sources may look different even though the IRR is the same. So transitioning to development, over the years I've had developers ask me how I would perform this analysis for new construction. While I don't include this analysis in Tactica's multifamily development model, there's various reasons for it that I'll touch on shortly here. I do think it's a fantastic exercise to build out the model and can reinforce just a stronger understanding of how the IRR metric works. There is a disclaimer. Classifying these cash flows is subjective. There's a lot of gray areas on how different revenue sources and expense sources should be classified. The way I'm doing things, it's not set in stone. You might be watching this and you may think that there's a better way to do it or a better way to classify something, and that's okay. If you think there's something that's blatant where my rationale should be changed, feel free to let me know in the comments below. For the sake of saving time, I already have the formatting inputted I wanted, and I've named the column headers. So we have the present value of investment recovery, present value of cash flow, present value of appreciation, present value of refinance, and the present value of loan paydown. Before we grab the relevant information from the pro forma model, off to the side, let's stipulate a few things. So this is a development deal. There's going to be a refinance. And we want to set up this model so once we're in our pro forma and we're changing our assumptions, we want the IRR sources model that we're about to populate to be dynamic, to update with whatever assumptions we're inputting into the pro forma. So first, let's set up a formula that will track our refinance year. I'm going to do a sum if formula. I'm going to say if in row 23, I'm going to say is greater than 0. Then we want it to return the year from row 3. We do that, it returns 2 because the refi is happening in year 2. If we changed our lease up assumptions where the refi happened in year 3, now this cell would update automatically. For our hold period, this is going to be a manual input. So we're going to start with a 10-year hold, but we want to be able to adjust this and see how it affects IRR sources. And then finally, we need to grab the IRR from the return summary tab. So to do that, we'll do another sum if, and we'll go to return summary, and we'll look for the year in row 2, lock that cell, and that will tie, if it equals the hold period, then we'll come back to the return summary and grab the appropriate IRR. So 20.48% is the IRR in year 10. I'm going to close that so it's a little easier on the eyes. So as an example, if we change the hold period to 5 years, the IRR would adjust accordingly. Back to 10. And just to streamline this analysis a bit, there's some key assumptions and data points I just want to have on this tab for convenience. The first thing is initial equity. That's the cash we'd be putting into the deal in year 0. I'm going to go ahead to the project summary tab and grab this 9.8 million. And then the project cost can also be found on the same tab, the project summary tab, which is 32.678 million. And then the loan amount, back to the same tab, which was 22,875,000. And then the loan drawn amount. So a cool thing about this financial model is even though you're approved for a loan amount, depending on what you put in for your loan to cost assumption, you may not draw that much. So you may have like an operating reserve, but you stabilize the property faster than expected. You may not draw on the entire loan amount. It's usually very close, but not always the exact same. And I'll talk about this a little more later on, but we're going to need to know both amounts. So for the loan drawn, we're going to go to the budget and draw tab and go to this final construction loan balance cell and grab that. They're essentially the same. There's about a $400 difference, but we do need to have that information so that these IRR sources tie out. Let's begin grabbing the relevant data from the pro forma model. So the first thing we need to do is grab the investment recovery. Now, this is going to be a little different than how I did it in the value add model. I consider a refinance in a development deal as a return of initial capital. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that 9.8 million that we initially put into the deal, then I'm going to subtract out the future refinance proceeds. So really what this column will tell us, the money we get back that we put into this deal when we sell the asset one day, excluding the refinance proceeds. So what I'm going to do then in column 1 is I'm going to use an if formula. And I'm going to say if B4 equals the hold period, then we're going to take the initial equity minus, and then I'm going to go to the return summary tab and just grab this entire row. The refinance is only going to happen once, so I grab everything from column E to N so it would capture whenever the refinance happens, no matter what our underwriting assumptions are. I'm going to lock that cell, and then the false argument will just be 0. We would drag that formula down through year 10, and because in year 10, the year equals the hold period, and our initial investment recovery beyond the refinance proceeds would populate as intended. Let's actually jump to the refinance section, since this column more or less ties in with the initial investment recovery. I'm going to write a similar if function. If the year equals, but instead this time it's going to be the refi year, not the hold period, because we're going to get the refi proceeds during the refi year. I'll lock that cell, and then it will equal the refi proceeds that are stipulated in row 23. The false argument will be 0. Close the formula and drag down through year 10. This is an opportunity where we can do an initial air check. So I'm going to write down here, check 1. The present value of investment recovery and the refinance should always equal the initial equity put into the deal. So I'm going to go ahead and do I'm going to take the sum of this column and column F, and it adds out to 9.8 million, which was the initial equity put into the deal. So we're good. Next, let's go grab the cash flow from the pro forma model. So I'm going to do another if function, but it's going to be slightly different than the two we've done previously. We're going to say if the year is less than or equal to the hold period, lock that cell, Then we need to do an offset formula to grab the relevant cash flow data from the pro forma model. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to set our offset reference cell is cell D25. We're going to lock it. There's not going to be a rows argument, so we're going to leave it blank. There's going to be a columns argument. We're going to come back to the IRR sources and select B4. So as we're dragging this formula down, it will grab cash flow further to the right. And there won't be a height or a width argument. I'm going to close that. The refinance proceeds were included in this amount. So I'm going to subtract out refi proceeds by using another offset function. We'll set that as D23, lock that cell. No rows argument. The columns argument again will be B24. And then the false argument of the if function will be 0. Year 1 cash flow was 0 because that's when the property is still being developed. And then we have the cash flow from operations populating in years 2 through 10. The present value of appreciation is next. So we're going to do another if function if the year equals the hold period. Appreciation won't be realized until you sell the asset, which ties to the hold period. And then we're going to use another offset function. We're going to return to the return summary tab, and there's a couple different rows that are relevant for appreciation. Most important is the residual sale value. We also need to factor in the cost of sale and the disposition fee. We don't have a disposition fee in this model, but we still want to include that row. So if you're ever modeling a project that has a dispo fee, it's going to be included in the IRR sources. It will be dynamic. So we're going to say offset return summary. We will set our reference cell as D28, lock it. There's going to be no row argument. Our column argument will be the year, which is B4. No height, no width arguments. And then we're going to say plus. And I'm just going to save some time, I'm going to copy and paste this formula 2 different times. And remember the sale proceeds were in row 28. The sale cost was in row 29. And the dispo fee, if there were one, would be in row 30. And I'm just going to overwrite those cell references to include them. And then we need to subtract out the project cost, right? We're appreciation. So we're taking our future sale value minus what it costs to build the asset, which we already inputted on this tab to save time, which is the 32.68 million. We're going to lock that cell. And then the final thing we need to do is just calculate the delta between the loan amount and the loan drawn. It's a minor delta, a couple $100, but again, to get it to tie out perfectly, we need to include what that amount is. And then our false statement for the initial if function will be 0. Close the bracket, drag down through year 10. The last thing we need to do is track the present value of the loan paydown, the fixed loan we would get after the refinance. We'll say equals if the year equals hold period, lock that cell. We'll take the permanent financing proceeds, which are going to hit the pro forma in row 20, lock it, close the bracket, and then plus offset. We want to look at the loan paydown, so we would set the reference as D31, no row argument. The column argument is going to be the year in column B, no height or width argument. We can close that bracket. And then we also want to account for any fees that are associated with the financing. So in this instance, we'll do a sum formula, and we'll come back to the return summary tab and grab any permanent financing costs or refi fees that would take place during the refinance year. We'll lock those cells, close the bracket, set our false argument as 0, close the bracket. And now when we drag this down through year 10, cash flow would effectively pay off a little more than $3 million of the principal balance over a 10-year hold. Technically an 8-year hold because we would get the financing at the end of year 2. Now we need to discount these cash flows, and we do that with either a present value formula or a NPV formula. So we'll do a negative present value formula so it returns a positive. We will set the rate as the IRR. We're going to discount the cash flow at the IRR. The number of periods will be the holding period. Year 10, we'll lock that cell. There's no payment argument. And then the future value, we can sum years 1 through 10, close the bracket, and we get $769,813. That nearly $5 million we would get in an investment recovery, an initial investment recovery, is only worth $770,000 when discounted at the IRR in today's terms. I'm going to copy and paste this formula across columns E, F, and G. We need to make a slight modification in the refinance formula. We're getting this cash flow back in year 2, so it shouldn't be discounted for 10 years, only 2 years. And then the present value calculation for the cash flow is slightly different. We'll use a NPV formula this time. The rate is the IRR, and then we'll just manually grab years 1 through 10, and we have all of our present values. Now we should sum these, and it should equal the initial equity we put into the deal. So that's check 2. Does the total, once we add up all of our present values of future cash flows, equal the initial equity we put into the deal? Yes, total equals initial equity. The next step is to total all of the cash flows each year, but we don't want to include the year. We want it to end through column C. And then drag down through year 10. And check 3 would be making sure that the cash flows that we calculated in column H, does it equal the pro forma cash flows? So if we come back to the return summary and we're looking at the cash flows in row 25, do they add out? Yes, they do. And then we can make just a quick manual calculation in year 10 because it's cash flow plus residual sale proceeds. 27,918. Come back to the IRR sources. 27,918. We're good there. And now the final step is to divide the present value of each component by the total equity in the deal. So we take the present value of initial investment recovery divided by the 9.8 million, and the allocation is 7.85%. We can drag that over. And the final check to make sure this model is accurate, does it equal, do all of these allocations add out to 100%? If we do a sum formula, grab each column, they do add out to 100%. So just as a reminder, check equals 100%. Yes. So we're in a good spot. This model is accurate. Personally, I like this distribution because it's pretty even across all 5 components. You can see that the cash flow plays a big part in this at nearly 24% of the IRR contribution. There's a lot of appreciation. There always is going to be a significant amount of appreciation in development year. The refinance is incredibly important as well. The loan pay down doesn't play as prominent of a role, but it does help. What I think is interesting is looking at how the components change with the shorter term hold. So if we put the hold period to 5 instead, everything still adds out. It's accurate. We made this thing dynamic, but there's much more emphasis now on appreciation, 44%, way less emphasis on cash flow. This analysis really made it apparent to me when you're looking at any kind of investment, longer term holds really help smooth out potential investment blips. I think longer term holds really de-risk the deal. You can see here there's just a lot more pressure on things that you you don't control as much, such as the appreciation and the refinance being the biggest 2 components of the IRR. You're heavily dependent on the capital markets when relying on those 2 components. There is a scenario where this model won't work, and that's if the hold period equals the refi year. If you were only going to hold for 2 years, so maybe you're a merchant developer and you don't plan to refinance, the model's not accurate right now. We could have built this model so it could handle this scenario, but it would be a lot of extra complexity. And in my opinion, it's not, if you're a merchant developer selling as soon as the asset's stabilized, this analysis doesn't give you a lot of value anyways. I'll show you why. So like if we I'm just going to overwrite some formulas. If you were to sell in year 2, the refi would be 0. The loan pay down would also be 0, right? Because you just have a construction loan that you would pay off when you sell the property. You would never have an amortizing loan. And then we would need to come into the present value of investment recovery. I'm going to delete this part of the formula that subtracts out the refinance. So now this column calculates truly just getting that 9.8 million back that you initially put into the deal when you go sell the project in year 2. And when you look at the allocations now, the only thing that matters is appreciation and getting your initial investment back. There's a tiny bit of cash flow, but obviously it's immaterial when you're a merchant developer and you're looking to just sell the property for more than hopefully you constructed it for. So why isn't this analysis included in Tactica's multifamily development model? Well, if you're watching this video, it's clear that you love the analytical side of multifamily investment, but not everybody does. This analysis is complicated. The development model is already a sophisticated model, and it just might be overwhelming to certain customers. While this is an analysis I include in Tactica's value add model, I don't think it's widely utilized. I've actually considered taking it out just to simplify even more. It's really only the diehard customers that are really into the numbers and really into the analytical side of real estate that use that. But in my opinion, it's probably one of the least used features in that particular tool. I also think that the real value of the IRR Sources is building this model from scratch. Anyone can come onto Tactica's website or this video and build it into their own underwriting model or one of Tactica's models. I've heard of people doing it in both. I've talked to people that have their own proprietary Excel tools and they love this analysis and they've reached out to me telling me, hey, I really appreciate you putting the blog post together. I've incorporated this exact analysis in my specific model. And as you just saw, this analysis is totally useless for merchant developers. If you're going to build and sell immediately, all the yield's going to come from appreciation and recouping your initial equity investment. That's going to wrap up the tutorial video. Calculating the internal rate of return is helpful, but understanding the actual components of the IRR can be far more insightful. Remember, 2 different projects with the same IRR can have totally different risk profiles. I encourage you to give making an IRR Sources model a shot in your own financial model or in one of Tactica's. You can check back in on this video and definitely bookmark the IRR and development blog post that's linked below. If you've been enjoying Tactica's investment analysis content, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like the video, subscribe to our channel, and allow us to notify you when we're releasing new video content. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Take care.